something horrible is going to happen today. No, I can only tell you that our lives are going to be changed forever today. They were in a horrific accident. My daughter didn't survive her injuries. I was shocked to see that there's an abundance of evidence from things like not only mediumship, but near-death experiences and deathbed visions and reincarnation and after-death communications. Remote viewing is a process by which some people are able to send their consciousness to a distant target and actually view that target. The interesting thing to me, though, I drew those concentric circles on Friday. She drew them on Wednesday, which raised the issue of who was remote viewing who. The evidence seems to point to the fact that in spiritual terms, you would say the soul releases from the body. Over the course of 5 years after my daughter died, I had 74 dream visitations from her, which is really unusual, especially for somebody like me that's not very intuitive.
What's more real, physics or spirit?
That's a trick question.
Hello, Bob, sir. Welcome to the Samir Show. How are you, sir?
I'm very good. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for coming. Today is really interesting topic about the death. I hope no one wants to talk about, but it's really, as per I say that I'm a very spiritual guy, and I wanted to know more about the death. As you already had an experience for that one, that can you just brief about that? What was your experience, and what you gonna share about your life and the tragedy it happened with your family?
Well, um, you know, uh, 23 years ago, um, I would have scoffed at the conversation we're having today. I was a logical left brain thinker, and the notion that we could somehow survive, physical death seemed absurd to me. I said, well, what could possibly survive? We are our brains. Our brains produce consciousness. Our brains are no more, therefore we're no more. And, just wishful thinking to believe that we go on. Um, and then in 2002, actually, in the morning of September 1st, 2002, my wife woke up in bed at 3:30 in the morning, and she sat up straight and she was trembling and she was ashen white. And I said, what's the matter? And she just stared at me. She wouldn't talk. I said, what's the matter? And finally she said, something horrible is going to happen today. And I said, well, what does that mean? Can you tell me more? And she said, no, I can only tell you that our lives are going to be changed forever today. And normally I would dismiss something like that because in my frame of reference, I didn't believe in precognitive visions and so forth. But in our lives together, she had several of these episodes of visions, and every one of them played out exactly the way she said they would. They were all good things, but logic told me if she was right then, she could be right now. And what a parent does when you hear something like that is you watch over your kids, which I did. One of my kids was back in college, the other one was going to college the next day, and my youngest one was working at a part-time job before school started in high school the next day. And, to make a long story short, I let my guard down at night. We went out to a restaurant. Two of my kids were with me. We had two cars. I let the kids drive home in one car. They were in a horrific accident. My daughter didn't survive her injuries, and my son had very serious injuries and was airlifted to a hospital with brain injuries. And, I didn't know at that point whether I was going to lose two children or one. And eventually, when my son came out of a coma and it was clear that he was going to recover, because I was in shock, for a considerable amount of time, I remembered that morning. I said, wait a second, how did Fran, my wife, know? Because she knew. I mean,
Hmm.
I looked at it, so that became my quest to find out two questions. Is it possible that she survived a physical death? Did her consciousness or mind or soul, continue on?
Mm.
Um, and, if so, where is she? So I started meeting with medical doctors and scientists that studied the mind and consciousness. And I read voraciously, I mean, hundreds upon hundreds of books. And one thing led to another. And the more I studied, the more I learned. And I was shocked to see that there's an abundance of evidence from things like not only mediumship, but near-death experiences and deathbed visions and reincarnation and after-death communications and a host of things, not to mention pure telepathy and remote
Right.
viewing
Mm.
and ESP,
Mm.
all things showing that our minds can act independently of our physical brains. And that's a prerequisite to believing in life after physical death.
Right, agree. So everything, as you know, that the brain might be light, but what if the thoughts don't live in your brain at all? Is there any scientific basis for the idea that our consciousness exists independent of the body, as you recently said, that our
Yeah.
mind could work independently out of our body?
Well, yeah. I mean, you take our maybe your listeners may be familiar with remote viewing. Remote viewing is a process by which some people are able to send their consciousness to a distant target and actually view that target.
Hmm.
The United States government, the CIA, was well aware of these people, and during the Cold War with Russia, they set up what's Stargate program, which was classified for many, many years. Now it's declassified. So
Hmm.
they would ask these remote viewers they would give them latitude and longitude coordinates and not tell them anything else. And they
Okay.
would ask them to go to these sites, and these sites would typically military bases and bomb silos and things of that nature, factories. And these people were able to view it and draw, yeah, very specific illustrations and drawings of what they saw, to great detail. So what that showed, and now sometimes they would see something that wasn't there but was there in the past, and sometimes they would see something that was actually there in present time, and sometimes they would see something that wasn't there then, but it it appeared in the future, which
Hmm.
showed that time as we know it, the rules didn't apply. And I did my own experiment many, many years ago where I, I asked people to, every night at a certain time, my instructions to a couple of hundred people was that I was going to draw a picture. And I
Hmm.
gave the specific time I was going to do that. And I asked people to tune their minds to what I'm doing, for lack of a better term, even if they thought they had no ability.
Hmm.
Draw a picture every night and then physically mail me, the photos. And at the beginning, the results were coming in, and I was very disappointed. It was nothing significant. But
Okay.
the very last envelope that came in,
Hmm.
uh, the woman drew three of my drawings exactly the way I drew it, including on the last day, I decided I'm not going to make a drawing. I was going to draw a geometric shape, and I drew a dot with concentric circles around it. And she got that. The
Where-
interesting thing was,
And where
I
was that
drew.
woman?
Well, this woman was just a woman from Bend, Oregon. I don't know who she
Oh,
was,
oh,
and
okay.
and I. The interesting thing to me, though, I drew those concentric circles on Friday. She drew them on Wednesday, which raised the issue of who was remote viewing who, and
Wow.
and the other ones, were exact. And the two that she missed were, she had all the components, as is often the case, but she didn't put it together. So, logically, to answer your question, here was I was sitting in my home in New York at the time, and my brain is obviously in my head, and she's sitting 3,000 miles away with her brain in her head,
Hmm.
in Oregon, if we were uh, if our brain was if consciousness was an epiphenomenon of the brain, that's not possible. But here clearly something was acting independently of the physical brain.
Right.
And there are many examples of that, like a power of prayer, distant healing, just telepathy, extrasensory perception, precognition. So there are many instances, near-death experiences. People, their brains are no more. They meet every definition that medical science has for death. They have no brain waves, they have no respiration, they have no heartbeat, they have no reflexes. Medical science says they're dead.
Hmm.
And yet, what happens for those who are resuscitated? They describe clear and lucid thinking, and they describe being above their body, actually being able to describe everything that went on in the operating
Yeah.
room,
Hmm.
or being above the hospital, and then, or in different places at once. So there are a lot of examples of this, and it's becoming, kind of just the materialist thinkers refuse to acknowledge it. But yet the evidence is overwhelming, and a lot of the scientists, they just refuse to look at the data because in their mind, if this was true, it
Hmm.
would violate everything that they were taught over the many years.
Yeah, agree, agree. So that particular woman that you talk about, did
Yeah.
you ever talk to them? Talk to her?
Yeah. I tried because I was interested, and it turns out that she had many intuitive gifts. This
Hmm.
remote viewing was only one of them.
Hmm.
She would communicate with the dead. She was very telepathic. But as is often the case, she had this as a child,
Okay.
and it scared her,
Hmm.
and she refused to acknowledge it.
Hmm.
And even to the that present day, she didn't do anything with the gifts. I mean,
Oh, okay.
she could have done, but we try to encourage people to embrace these things.
Hmm.
Fear is this something that's ingrained by our culture or our media and so forth. But we're taught to fear something that we can't perceive with our known physical senses, but we
Yeah,
have
agree.
other senses that people don't know about.
So, what happens to the consciousness at the moment of the death? Does it simply turn off or it goes somewhere else?
Yeah, well, the evidence seems to point to the fact that the um, in spiritual terms, you would say the soul releases from the body. you know um, I often use soul and consciousness and mind interchangeably. That non-physical essence of ourselves does shed the body and continues on. Now, not only does it continue on, but it continues on with memory and personality still intact, which we know, from high level, mediumship. Now, I can't tell you that it's forever like that. I mean, after all, our memories as human beings is limited. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes I can't remember what I had for
Hmm.
breakfast yesterday, So to think that we are all knowing and we remember every single fact of our life is doesn't seem realistic. But um, I think that for at least for a period of time, it does, and mediums sometimes take on the personality of the people that's communicating, through them, and sometimes it's quite amazing. I think that the reason that mediumship takes place is that there's a resonance, some sort of resonance between the three parties involved: the person in the spirit realm,
Hmm.
the medium, and the sitter, the person getting the reading. And if those things are not meshing,
Hmm.
a reading's not going to take place. But and I believe that the main purpose of somebody after they cross over and realize that they're still alive is to provide evidence either directly or through a medium that they still exist.
Hmm.
So our grief won't be as heavy, And usually people say, well, why, all these seemingly insignificant facts, come through because that's the evidence that you would recognize, if they're bringing through wisdom, in general terms, you're not gonna, it's not gonna do much, for you to believe that they still exist.
Right. So when you, let's say, when you talk about the death to someone, how generally they react about that one? Suppose if you want to discuss something related to that, even the doctors or some the persons who never want to talk about the death, how you communicate them and how they get convinced.
Yeah. Well, we don't try to convince anybody. We simply, lay out the evidence. But I mean, listen, you mentioned doctors. I 2 years after my daughter died, I went to my family doctor, who was I had some ailment. I don't remember what it was, and I hadn't seen him in a while. So he says, "Hey, Bob, how you doing?" I said, "Okay." He says, "What have you been doing?" I said, "Well, if you really want to know," he says, "Yeah." I said, "I'm studying survival of consciousness." He just looked at me. We talked for another 5 minutes, and he said, "Can I ask you something?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "What's survival of consciousness?" So I start telling him some of the things that we're just talking about. He's a medical doctor, a man of science. And after we talked for about 40 minutes, and he never did ask me why I was there medically, but he was interested in the
Yeah.
subject. He closes the door and he gets a real serious look on his face. And he walks over to me. He says, "Can I tell you something in confidence?" I said, "Sure." He says, "My father died 8 years ago." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." And he said, "I had a lot of critically ill patients in the hospital, and I needed to call my answering service, that morning to check up on these patients." And he called, and the woman that he was speaking to said, "Oh, doctor, your father called." And he said, "My father died at 9 o'clock this morning." And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, doctor. We must have gotten the message wrong. He must have said your father-in-law." He said, "My father-in-law has been dead for 16 years." He said, "What time did the message come in?" She said, 9:15. He said, "Read me back the message." The message was, "Hi, Frank, it's me. I'm okay." Now, he that shook him, even though, he didn't believe it.
Mm.
And up to that point, he had never told a soul, and didn't tell his wife. He never told his kids about this or anybody. Certainly was going to tell his colleagues.
Mm.
And that was 20 years ago. And I could guarantee you that he's never told anybody since. So it's a shame that he feels that he has to suppress these things because there's millions of such reports that that are around, but people are afraid of being labeled or judged, so they don't talk to them. Also, there are some people, they become defined by their grief.
Mm.
So if I suggest to such a person who doesn't believe in life after death that their loved one still survives, they take that as a personal insult because in their mind it minimizes the depth of their grief because they identify with their grief. That's who they have become. And
Mm.
if I suggest to them that their loved one isn't really dead, how dare you say such a thing? So those people, there's nothing that we could do. But what we found is that for other people who are open to the idea, if they become convinced by the evidence, or if they have some sort of a profound personal or spiritual experience that convinces them, that can have enormous positive effects on their grief.
Mm.
When we find that, and there have been clinical, peer-reviewed studies that have shown this to be true. Those who believe that we continue on do better in their grief than those who don't, because that makes sense. It's logical. Because what could give you more hope than believing that they're not really gone?
So mostly that you are talking to kind of the age of more than 50, or it could be the younger person also.
Yeah, I mean, the people in the foundation that join are all ages,
Okay.
people that are very old and people that are very young, I mean, it's people want to learn more. Forever Family Foundation runs grief retreats. They're weekend retreats in different parts of the United States, and we immerse them in all of these things. We have grief professionals, we have mediums, we have scientists, and the whole bit. And for the most part, most people, walk away from the weekend in much better shape than when they got there. You see this lightness for the first time that gives them some hope to continue on, and that's a wonderful thing.
So have you ever in your life that you see a person who is almost going to die and suddenly he died? Did you feel something that see in every movie or everything that we are checking, right? Even on the in the books, that soul is coming out from our body and it goes into the universe and keep it into the particles kind of things. Have you ever feel kind of things?
Yeah, there have been uh, books written about deathbed visions, where people who are in that window of like either imminent death or 2 weeks before death, suddenly, even though they may be incapacitated, and I've witnessed it with my own family many times, they reach out and they're talking to somebody that you can't see.
Hmm.
Usually it's their mom, but it could be other people that they love. And the suggestion of that, the implication is that we all have assistants, escorts to the other side when our time comes. But I have sat with people, for instance, my mother-in-law, when she was dying, she was in a rehab facility and she was in a hospital bed, and above the bed um, was a pole with those triangle things that they hang the IV,
Hmm.
tubes from, big solid, thing. And at the moment my mother-in-law passed, you know, I looked up and that triangle was swinging back and forth, and it was
Wow.
separated from the bed. Not like anybody bumped into it or anything.
Hmm.
So who knows? Uh, I think that being with somebody as they die, many people describe it as a very spiritual experience because, like you say, they feel something. Some people also are able to see what they call the silver cord, which is like a cord made of non-physical material,
Hmm.
and they see that release from the body, and then so our consciousness or our soul, goes off, and the body is left behind. There are also cases of what's called shared death experience, where people, the loved ones of the person that's dying, they're sitting around and they see the same thing that the dying person is seeing,
Hmm.
for instance, like a mom coming to visit. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of people describe seeing a light in the corner of the room at the moment of death, which they
Hmm.
view as the soul releasing. So, that's a common thought in this area.
So what does the neuroscience says about the death, life after death?
Yeah, well, the problem is that nobody in all of these years has able to define consciousness. Nobody still, if anybody tells you they know what it is, they don't.
Hmm.
There's a lot of theories about it, so neuroscientists talk about there might be, microtubules in your brain that act in a quantum fashion. That a lot of common thought is that our brains act as receivers. So they're not producing the signals, they're receiving the signals, and they're also a filter, and they filter out all this information that surrounds us. So using that model, when the brain is incapacitated, the receiver like a radio or a TV is broken,
Hmm.
but the signal still exists. And the signal, sometimes I believe the brain is bypassed and the information comes to us through other methods.
Right.
So um, but and then you asked before, like, where does the soul go? Well, I mean, to the theory is that to another dimension, so that dimension could be right in front of us. And whenever you mention like the afterlife, whatever, people have a tendency to look up into the sky, but it could be just this membrane that separates one dimension from the other. Also, a lot of physicists believe in parallel lives and parallel universes.
Hmm.
So there may be many versions of you,
Hmm.
all um, in different dimensions, all doing things, at different times. So, it's kind of mind-boggling, when you think about it. But I think we've only scratched the surface of this stuff.
Do you believe in parallel universe?
And I'm certainly open to it. Yeah, I mean, um, you know, why not? I also, it doesn't make any sense to me to believe that in the universe with billions upon billions and billions of planets
Agree?
and billions of stars, if it's one part of a grand design, what kind of design is that the one little tiny speck is the only
Hmm.
source of life? I mean,
Hmm.
everything seems to be connected. So I think maybe not in our lifetime, but I think we'll find that we're connected with many different types of entities, many many different worlds.
Yeah, I agree. So medium claims to hear the dead, but can they pass as a scientific test? How do that evidential mediums pass the scientific screening for the accuracy and the authenticity?
Well, uh, scientists that study mediumship in research facilities and in university settings set up, blinded protocols. So the medium doesn't know the sitter, and there's many levels of separation.
Hmm.
And then they, score the accuracy of the information that's coming through. And that's been replicated many, many times. And it's been shown that some people are able to, without the use of fraud or deception, get evidential information from a discarnate source.
Hmm.
Um, we've been conducting our own medium certification process since 2005. So that's 20 years. We don't use scientific protocol because we want to replicate the reality of what happens where a medium sits, with a sitter. But we do, it's done under controlled conditions. We take steps, that the medium has no knowledge of the sitter and totally, separated. And in my first book, The Medium Explosion, I stated that 85 to 90% of all the practicing mediums today can't do what they claim. And that didn't make me very popular in the mediumship community. Um, but it was based on my own
How
data.
can you say that?
Yeah. I have 20 years of data, and that's what happens in our own process. Only 10 to 15% of the mediums that go through it actually pass. And I didn't write the book to bash or expose mediums as frauds. It was the opposite. I wanted to show that there are 10 to 15% of these people that can do it at a very, very high level, and they can have profound effects, on the lives of people. So, in our process, there's many different levels of screening, but eventually when they make it to that point, they do five different readings for five different sitters that they don't know, the sitter being the person getting the reading. And then we have five different scoring methods in the evidence, and they have to meet the minimum guidelines of each of the five. So, to give you an idea how tough it is, we've been doing it 20 years, and we've certified 27 mediums over those 20 years. So you do the math, it's a little more than one a year. Yeah, so it's, we take it very seriously.
So, do you believe that are there any dangers in the mediumship, kind of emotional manipulations, or the grief exploitation, or it worse?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons we started the certification program is that there are many of these practitioners that are out there without any ability, just doing it to make money.
Okay.
There are some that are well-meaning, but they're underdeveloped, and they don't really have they may have some psychic ability, getting information from another living source. But that's different from getting information from a discarnate source. And these people, they're right on the front lines dealing with people that are in extreme grief.
Hmm.
So if you go to a medium and you get a terrible reading, you're going to walk away from that reading in worse shape than when you came. And these people are they're not, although some have taken some training in grief. They're not therapists, and they should never represent themselves as one. But they have to be aware of the state of mind that the people are in, as they're reading them. And when you think about it, they're interacting on a mental health level with the public,
Hmm.
but there are no licensing requirements.
Hmm.
There's no there are no examinations of their ability, proficiency
Hmm.
guidelines.
Hmm.
There's no continuing education. There are no regulatory bodies. So tomorrow you can go and open up an office and put up
Hmm.
a sign. You're the medium and Bob the medium and start charging people a lot of money and it goes on. So it's it's a problem.
So
And
whoever.
especially today in this social media, I
Hmm.
mean, I could find out everything about you just about by a couple of clicks. And I could just be spitting that back to you. It's which
I
you
agree.
couldn't do that 50 years ago, but you can now.
Yeah. So whenever that someone is asking for that certifications kind of thing, that are you checking any kind of a mental state to them? That is he eligible or is she eligible for the mediumship?
Um, well, the way we screen them is we first ask them a set of seemingly simple questions that we need answers for, to just checking for any red flags.
Okay, let's say I'm coming. What's your
Yeah.
question?
Yeah. So, well, we never solicit any medium because that dilutes the integrity of the process. So they come to us. So you send me an email, or you send the foundation email that you're interested in more information. I send you these questions. It comes back. It's reviewed. If it looks okay, we send them, they give them access to a 7-page application.
Wow.
It's
Okay.
very extensive. And a lot of people, I'd say out of every 10 applications that we send out, maybe we get back one or two because what happens,
No one
pe-
wants to fill up the
yeah,
7 page.
yeah, people think that it's like one of these, mail order reverends. You send us money and we send you a certificate and you're on your way. When they see it's a serious stuff, no, they'll send it back. And then when they send back an application, then it's reviewed by a committee, and if it looks good, then we invite them to take part in one of these sessions, or 5 sessions where we evaluate the evidence.
So how, what is that after death communications and how it different from the hallucination and memory?
Um, Hallucination and memory. Well,
Yeah.
a lot of scientists dismiss all this stuff as hallucinations, as they do near-death experiences and so forth. I once did a survey where I asked people, would they rather get communication from their deceased loved one directly
Mhm.
directly from their loved one, or through the services of a medium? And when I asked that question, I was convinced that the majority were going to say that they would rather have their loved one communicate with them directly.
Hmm.
But that wasn't the case, that most of them said through a medium. So then I started to probe why, because it didn't make sense to me. And there were two reasons. The first one was that they wouldn't trust the information if they were getting it directly, because they thought maybe it was their own a product of their own grief or their own hallucination, whereas if they got it from a third party, a so-called professional, then
Mm,
they could trust it. And the other reason was that a lot of people were fearful, as we discussed earlier. They were afraid of things that um, that are part of this non-physical, unseen world. So then I started to understand. But yeah, I mean, one argument that people use in near-death experiences is that all of these things that people describe, the life review, the leaving the body, being greeted by the deceased loved ones, are part of anoxia, oxygen deprivation, so the hallucinations.
mm,
But if you ever seen people that have anoxia, like fighter pilots, it's anything but clear and lucid. It's disjointed and they're thrashing about and it's not, very comfortable. Whereas these people, they describe everything being realer than real,
mm.
and thinking everything clearly. So it doesn't seem to fit.
So after, suppose if anyone take the certifications from your class, right? Have they tried their own about to experiment about the same thing?
Well, I mean, for the most part, the people that come to us are already practicing mediums, So, I mean, they've already been doing this, some for quite a while. They just want the credibility of having the certification. So they're already experienced in doing readings. The way that usually starts is that they have the ability as a child or as a young adult or, or sometimes it manifests when they're already an adult and they start doing readings for friends and family. And then they would say, sometimes the friends and family say, wow, you should do this, become a professional medium. Sometimes that's bad advice.
Mm,
Just because you're able to communicate doesn't mean you have to do it professionally. You could be a personal communicator, and whatever. So um, most of the people, they're not coming to us without ever, having tried this before. They're already have practice. The scary thing is that some of the mediums that come to us are already been doing it for many, many years, and they have big practices, and they charge a lot of money, and they don't pass the certification. So that's a little troubling, but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So why the people generally call for that kind of people? On what
Well,
conditions they are looking for that? I need a kind of a mediumship persons that.
because they've been trying to, they never get signs or after death communications from their loved ones, and they never get communications, and they're
So they
desperate.
wanted to communicate with them.
Yeah, they want to communicate with them. I mean, that's what everybody wants to do. They want to communicate with them. So if they can't do it on their own, they'll do it through a third party, through somebody else, And that's why people go to mediums, and mediums are, enormously, the better ones become enormously popular. I mean, unfortunately for us, many of the mediums that we certified over the years have become famous. They TV and books. And what happens is that after they get that fame, they do fewer and fewer readings. They have waiting lists that are years long, and they charge sometimes like an obscene amount of money, which doesn't, we're doing this as a resource for the bereaved that doesn't help.
Yeah.
So we're always trying to identify newer mediums that are very, very good and don't have the, they have access, for people, So.
But do you feel that many times that people can be the fraud?
I'm fully aware that people in a reading sometimes they make information fit. Like
Hmm.
the medium will say something and it's not really very accurate, but they're so desperate to believe that the
Yeah.
person is desperate to believe that their loved ones still exist that they'll make it fit,
Hmm.
and I try to advise sitters, how to act, give, simple answers, don't volunteer any information and be on the lookout for what constitutes general information during specific information. For instance, if you're the medium and you're giving me a reading, you could see approximately how old I am.
Hmm.
So you say to me, Bob, I have your grandmother here. Is your grandmother in spirit? Well, yeah, but she'd be 120 right now, so she might be one of the oldest people on there. So it's a pretty damn good bet, you know. So I would have to mark that as a hit because it's true, but it's very, very general and it's not significant. But if you said to me, Bob, I have your grandmother Rebecca here, and her name was Rebecca, and you gave me three or four really strong pieces of evidence that couldn't be researched, that you would agree should be scored more heavily, have more weight in the scoring, and that's what we do. General information is not scored with the same value that a specific piece of information is.
So after this all you experience that, are you getting good sleep?
Am I getting?
Good sleep in the night?
Oh,
I'm just curious.
I'm not a good sleeper, but that's mainly because I run this foundation, with 17,000 members. I'm always thinking that I do this, do I have too much in my head, you know, like you, I had a real job, for many years, and a career, and then I retired from that and started doing this work full time, and I work a lot harder for free in this work than I did getting paid in the other.
So have you get any kind of experience? Let's suppose someone is trying to experiment about the mediumship. Someone is calling that spirit of their own family members. And after that, that family member or that spirit still keep in that particular person who call it. It never left their world.
You mean becomes part of that person,
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah.
yeah? Well, there are a lot of cases, of people call it, possession. Where
Yeah.
people who pass to the other side that had this real strong attachment to the earthly life.
Mm.
Certain habits and smoking or
Mm.
foods, whatever, and they try to get absorbed into the body of somebody here so they could experience those things, and then, but for the most part, and then a common question that people ask is, how come negative spirits don't come through in these readings?
Yeah,
Now,
exactly. Yeah.
I've asked, hundreds upon hundreds of mediums that same question, and they all tell me that before they do a reading, they ask their guides in spirit to surround them with white light and only allow, you know, good, intentions, to come through, whether that's true or not. But I can say that after witnessing, 1,000 of these readings over the years, I've never seen a negative, entity come through in one. Right? So that doesn't mean that they don't exist. It just means that they're not getting through, to the mediums. So I can't say for sure, but I think that, look, everything in the universe it's all about balance. I think there's positive energy and there's negative energy, and I think that negative forces do exist. But what channeled reports and what mediums tell us and people that have near-death experiences, that once we cross over to this other world, it's a world of compassion and empathy and love. And you may have been a miserable person in your earthly life, but that was in your earthly life. It's totally different. And then people also ask, well, where do you go?
Mm.
Because people that have religious convictions, they believe in various um, heavenly and hell-like. You go to heaven, you go to hell, and they have different names for it. I
Mm.
think that I personally don't believe that there's a deity that says, okay, you go here and you go there. I think it's all self-judgment.
Mm.
People that have near-death experiences talk about a life review where their whole life is shown to them. Um, and they get to experience, they feel all the good that they've bestowed upon others. They also feel the harm
Mm.
that they've caused to others, and that probably doesn't feel so well. And that people wind up with others that are of like mind. So if you were somebody that lived a pretty good life and kind and loving and compassionate, you'll wind up with people in the same. If you were Adolf Hitler, you're going to be with other people like,
Hmm.
Adolf Hitler. But the overriding theme is that there's always progression. That there's help on the other side, and you move closer to the light, so to speak, and in various stages. So um, we won't know for sure till we get there, but
Yeah. And recently that scientist has found that kind of a, that infralights kind of thing.
yeah.
So they have keep it in the one body and he was living, but after the death happened, that what happened, that it's kind of some lights happen within that face only, and the rest of the body it was kind of a blue light. So after that it happens that your whole body except that your face having the lights, they except the other body has kind of a blue lights kind of thing.
Mm,
So that's a research found. Another research found that they tried with the multiple plants and uh, what I say that rat. It's the same thing that they injected something that kind of a poison things, and what happened that after the death of that plants, very microparticles lights are coming out of that. That's called I think the RSO. That's particular element.
yeah.
That, so it's very nanoparticles. It's very hard to see in our own eyes.
Yeah, I mean, most of, like 99% of the sound and light spectrum, and
Yeah, exactly.
frequency is,
Yeah.
is unseen to us. It still exists, but we just don't see it. Speaking of plants, there was a scientist named Cleve Baxter. I believe he,
Mm,
he invented the lie detector. But in his laboratory, he had plants. And what he did in one experiment is that he hooked up like these electrodes to the plants and he would monitor, the sort of the
correct.
consciousness level of
Mm,
plants. In the other end of his lab, in another room that was secluded,
mm,
he had a stove and he boiled water, and he took live shrimp
mm,
and he threw the live shrimp into the boiling water. And at the instant that happened, the plant in the other end of the lab,
mm,
the chart went crazy, which tended to show that we're connected. Plants have consciousness, and so do the shrimp.
mm.
And they were connected, and through non-physical means, the plant picked up the fact that the shrimp were being killed. So that's a very interesting study.
Wow.
I firmly believe that plants have some primitive
Yeah,
form of consciousness. Yeah.
I agree. Agree. So, do you believe that the scientific community is actively avoiding this research because of fear, money, or dogma?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, um, a lot of the medical doctors and scientists that we have worked with over the years have had great harm done to their careers. They've been ostracized, by the boards at the universities, and they had to do this work on the side
Mm,
because for the most part, they get shunned by, materialist thinkers. It's better now than when we first started. A lot of this is coming to the forefront, and it's more accepted than it was. Still have a while to go, but I think that people are starting to, listen, I've interviewed a lot of physicists over the years, and sometimes if I close my eyes, I could swear that I'm talking to a spiritualist because they're talking about the same thing.
mm,
A single point of light. We're all connected. Which quantum theory is experiments show that they could take two electrons with two different spins and shoot them out at the speed of light in different directions. If they change the spin of one of
mm.
the other electron instantly changes its spin, which shows that, we're connected over, tremendous, distances through different, dimensions. So, um, yeah, I mean, it's science and spirituality are not as different as people, think. The spirituals say, the same. They're talking about the same thing. How everybody's connected on a spiritual level, and so I think there's some sort of a convergence between the two.
So if loved one is still exists somewhere, should we should it grief feel different? Like how does the belief after the death change the grieving process psychology or emotionally?
Well, a lot of what we do is based on cognitive behavior therapy. If they could change the way you think about death,
Hmm.
that that can have a significant impact on your grief. So, and we see it, every day. So, those who I always say that there's a progression. There's a lot. If I ask 100 people how many people believe in an afterlife, a huge percentage are going to say they do for various reasons. But what they're really saying is that they hope there's an afterlife. I mean, they've never seen any evidence, but
Yeah.
but then sometimes that hope turns into belief
Hmm.
where they truly, they've seen some evidence, they've had some experiences, and they believe that we go somewhere else. For some people, they reach a knowing stage where there's all doubt is removed. And that comes, for me, I reached that point through science. For others, they have, you have a near-death experience, or you have an extraordinary mediumship reading, or you have a direct communication or a dream visitation, and that changes you. And once you know that your loved one still exists, people live their lives more fully. They go back to living a life that has meaning and purpose, whereas before they were lost. So it's a real thing.
So someone call it kind of a false hope. Others call it a divine comfort. Who is right?
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, a lot of the scientific community says it's a false hope, and the others say it's I mean, a lot of people will say, well, if it makes you feel better. When they used to say that to me, I used to want to strangle them. I don't want to know. Don't. It makes me feel better. I want to know the truth. So, I like they see as well. They live on in your heart. I don't want, of course they're going to live on in my heart, but I want to know that they live on, period. So, yeah, I mean, the old people, a lot of people are always going to think that, that's false hope. And that's the argument that they have about mediums. They think that all mediums are just giving false hope and they're taking advantage of the bereaved. Um, and the only way to combat that is by, raising the bar, for mediumship and educating them about the mediums and the process.
Are, are you believing in spiritual? Are you spiritual guy?
Yeah, I was not never a very religious people, and a lot of people they think that religion and spirituality are the same thing. I think that spirituality is religion just without the rules, but I since the death of my daughter and the death of my wife and others, I have become very spiritual, but totally non-religious, if that makes any sense. Yes. So I believe that there's a universal, a creator. I believe that we're all connected. I believe that um, we move on to other worlds. I just don't follow any of the dogma or the rules.
Yeah.
And there's also belief, look, in the Eastern religions, people believe that, like in Buddhism, that when you die, and you mentioned this at the beginning, that your soul kind of dissipates into the ether and just becomes one with the universe. That always disturbed me because that would, I wanted to believe that I could still communicate, like with my loved one.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's true. I think that happens eventually when we reach a certain level of enlightenment. But I think in the stages along the way, there's a lot more going on than that, personality, memories, and so forth.
So after your daughter's death, that have you tried to like use your mediumship to talk to her?
Well, yeah, I at the beginning, before my wife and I started the foundation. I mean, I didn't believe in the mediums, but my wife kind of dragged me along to go to, a couple of
Okay.
meetings with her.
Mhm.
And some were terrible, and some were, just driving home thinking it was so extraordinary. Like, where's the trick? I'm trying to come up with the trick.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, but in all of the years, in the 20 years that we're doing the mediumship thing, I never once had a reading with one of the mediums that I certified, despite the fact that I know that they're all top level. And the reason I tell you that is because the reason that I never did is because I couldn't trust the information because they all knew too much about me. Like
Mm.
they knew my story. So even though I know that they wouldn't resort to any fraud, that question would always be in my mind.
Mm.
So, but the medium, one medium in particular that I went to early on, sort of opened the door, and became, I wasn't convinced, but I became very open-minded about it, and that's what spurred my further research into that. I've had there's such a thing we call dream visitations, where uh, so-called normal dreams are very disjointed. They're all over the place. They don't like make much sense, and you forget them as soon as you wake up. Whereas in a dream visitation, you see your loved one, you could hug them, you could kiss them,
Yeah, I agree.
smell them, you could talk to them, and so, and it's quite different, and you remember them. Um, in over the course of 5 years after my daughter died, I had 74 dream visitations from her, which is really unusual, especially for somebody like me that's not very intuitive.
Mm.
Um, I journaled each one of them, which is valuable. I always recommend because you could refer back to it, later on. So that was sort of my lifeline, where I was convinced that she was, communicating with me. And I had since my wife was very intuitive. She was having all of these extraordinary signs and communications taking place. And I knew that one thing I could always say is that she never ever lied to me. So I knew that she wasn't making this up. So I was like sort of living vicariously through her experiences.
Have you
So
ever feel kind of a deja vu in your life?
yeah, deja vu is so hard to figure out. There are so many explanations.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know,
I feel many times. Huh?
yeah, I get a lot of deja vus, and I don't know. I still haven't figured it out. It could be something that I did in the past. It could be something that I did in a past life and I'm
Exactly. Yeah.
remembering. It could be some sort of precognition or retrocognition of something that happened in the past and the future, and I'm getting, glimpses of. So there's many different explanations, but it's real, and people have
Yeah,
them, all the time. And
I agree.
yeah.
Many times happened that in the past that it happened and suddenly it happened in the current situations that I thought this situation is already happened that once a month. I don't know when.
Yeah, I know. For many, many
And it
years.
was the exact situations, not even that kind of a 90-20 differentiation. It's the exact same that the person is sitting on the same place. We are talking the same topic kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd say for about 20 years, I had the same repetitive dream that I would get all the time, where I was walking through this old house and it had a secret room that I discovered, and the secret room was filled with antiquities and treasures and writings and books and the whole bit. And the room was, as you described, was always exactly the same or whatever. And the first time I had it, it was so strange. But then I just I kept having the dream over and over again. What's that? I know I was never in an old mansion like that. So, unless not in this life, anyways. So
Yeah.
I don't know what to make of it.
So if someone person call for the mediumship, that what are the key points that they want to ignore or to identify that person could be the fraud?
Well, fraudulent mediums resort to what's called cold readings. They look for bodily cues, and things. They tend to repeat the same information in different ways to give the perception that they're getting more hits. They ask you leading questions. With the good medium should never be asking you a question. You validate the information that they're giving you.
Hmm.
A lot of mediums, they think that if they give you messages like your father is telling me that he loves you,
Hmm.
that
That's a common.
yeah, their job is done. They made you
Yeah.
feel better. That's bullshit. So the messages are okay, but first you have to establish the evidence that the person knows that they're really communicating with you.
Hmm.
So if they're giving you all messages but no evidence, how can you accept, the messages? I tell people when they're getting a reading to try to, um, you have to validate, but give yes and no type answers. Yes, I understand that. No, I don't know what you're talking about, or I'm not sure, I need more, that kind of stuff. But people, like we were talking before, they're so desperate that they'll think that the medium is bringing through their loved one. And then all of a sudden the sitter starts, oh, yes, did you know that he did this and he did that, whatever? And I would just, stop, don't tell them that, how could you, how could you get any value out of this if you're giving all the information to them? So, yeah, you should, like I said, the medium will sense how old you might be. They might sense what ethnicity you are, so they'll say things,
Hmm.
that pertain to that ethnicity. So you sort of. I mean, I certainly can tell. A lot of people that can't tell, but yeah, you have to be on guard, especially now. One of our very credible mediums told me of a situation that he witnessed another medium, not part of our
Yeah.
organization, that was doing a private reading for a client on Zoom.
Hmm.
And on one side of her laptop, she saw the image of the sitter, like I'm seeing you.
Hmm.
And on the other side of her laptop, she had that person's Facebook page open.
Okay.
And she was just spitting back all the information that she saw on Facebook. And the sitter was like, "Oh, this is the greatest medium in the world. How does she know all that stuff?" But everything she was telling the sitter was fraudulent.
Yeah.
So that's something you have to, guard against now. When the mediums do a reading now, during our process, they don't have any information other than the sitter's first name. So there's no identifying information that they could look up.
Right.
So we take safeguards that way. But it is a concern when you book a private reading with a medium. Typically you have to give them your name and address, and because you have to pay them.
Exactly.
Usually
Yeah.
in advance. So they can look you up and have all that information beforehand. So
Yeah.
it's a shame.
Agree. Okay. It's a last. Let's have a rapid fire round. It's a one word answer. So, life after the death, real or illusion?
Real,
Consciousness, brain or beyond?
beyond,
Near death experience, dream or dimension?
not a dream, a dimension.
Mediums, gift or trick?
Both.
Okay. Ghost, energy or spirit?
Spirit. Oh, well, that'll take a further explanation, but for now we'll just say spirit.
Okay. Skeptics, necessary or blind?
I believe that skeptics are necessary. Let me just add, there's a difference between a skeptic and an open-minded skeptic. We all should be open-minded skeptics, but
Right.
when you're a skeptic, you ignore the evidence. That's not good.
Fear of death, natural or taught?
Taught,
The afterlife, light or void?
life or
Light or void?
oh, it's light,
The most dangerous myth about death. Choose one word. Hell, nothing, or final.
final.
If you died today, what would greet you first?
My loved ones.
Your soul, recycled or eternal?
Well, you're giving me some that's hard with one word, but if I have to go with one, I'll say eternal.
Religion, guide or control?
Control.
Heaven, place or state?
It's a state. It,
What's more real, physics or spirit?
that's a trick question. um, I would have to say spirit is actually more real.
And the last one, God or evil?
God or
Evil.
oh, I'll say God.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, it was really a great conversation, and it's an interesting topic, I must say.
Yeah, it is. I mean, everybody, whether they believe in it or not, it's still people like to talk about it.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Bob. It was a really
Okay.
wonderful
It was my
conversation.
pleasure. It was my
Yeah,
pleasure.
thank you.
Even though
Thank you.
you tried to trick me on the lightning round, but that's okay.
I
I
hope you
figured
like it.
out. It was good.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye bye.